Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. It started out as just another Instagram DM. You know the kind, super casual, a few emojis, a little small talk. Edwin and I have been chatting for a week or so, mostly about random stuff like food, music, and how weird it is to meet people online. Nothing seemed off about him at first. His pictures looked normal, kind of cute, decent style, seemed like someone you'd meet at a coffee shop. He even seemed kind of funny, at least from what I could tell through texts. So when he asked me out, I figured why not? We decided on a grill buffet, which felt kind of perfect for a first date. You can pick whatever you want, eat as much as you want, and there's no weird pressure to be fancy. Casual, but still a little nice, you know. When I showed up at the place, I recognized Edwin immediately. He was already there, sitting at a table for two, waiting. He looked like his pictures, maybe a little more disheveled in person, but it wasn't bad. He waved as I walked in, and I smiled back, kind of relieved to see that he wasn't a total creep. I'm sure you know the type. You be up, and the guy's nothing like his profile picture. Edwin at least seemed pretty chill. We grabbed our plates and went to the grill area where they had all kinds of meats, veggies, sauces, and more. Edwin seemed super eager, like way too eager for someone who's just having dinner with a girl they'd barely know. He started piling up his plate with meat and sides in a way that made me raise an eyebrow. But whatever, it's a buffet, right? People can take as much as they want. We sat back down, and he started digging in like he hadn't eaten all day. Not that I could blame him. The food did look good, but the way he attacked it was strange. He wasn't talking much, which made me feel a little uncomfortable. I tried to break the silence, talking about how my day went, what kind of music I like, stuff like that. But Edwin was barely responding. He was too busy cramming food into his mouth, barely looking up. I figured maybe he was just nervous, so I didn't push it. But then after a while, he started doing something weird. I was just sipping on my drink, trying to keep the conversation going, when I noticed him starting to scoop some onion rings onto his plate. And not in the normal, oh, let's get some onion rings to go with the meat kind of way. No, this was different. He was loading up his plate with onion rings, and then I saw him quietly stuff a few into his jacket pocket. At first, I thought maybe he just didn't want to get his hands greasy or something, but no, he kept going. A few minutes later, I watched as he grabbed a small plastic bag from his backpack, which was under the table, and started filling it up with more onion rings, wings, and whatever else he could get his hands on. I wasn't sure if I should say something or just let it slide, but this was getting weird. It got worse when I saw him sneakily push some of the food into my purse. Like, really, you're putting onion rings in my purse? I almost laughed at first because I couldn't believe it, but then the realization hit me that he wasn't joking. He was serious. He was actually stuffing my purse with food. It felt so bizarre that I couldn't even come up with a proper response. I could feel my face turning red. What was he doing? Was this some kind of weird prank? But no, this guy was actually trying to get his money's worth from a buffet by loading up my purse with leftovers. It's not like I wanted to look crazy and flip out in front of him, but at that point, I was starting to wonder if this guy was completely off his rocker. I guess maybe it was his way of trying to be smart about the situation, like he thought I wouldn't notice or something. But I was definitely noticing. My purse had food all over the inside of it now. It was so awkward. And what made it worse was that he didn't even acknowledge it. He just kept going like it was totally normal. He'd shovel a few more onion rings into my purse and then look around like he was waiting for something. It was honestly kind of eerie. I tried to make small talk again, asking about his job. What do you like to do outside of work? Anything to distract from the weirdness of the situation. But Edwin just kept eating and weirdly getting more food to store in my bag. My mind was racing. Was he planning to walk out of here with my purse stuffed with onion rings and chicken? Was I his getaway car for his buffet heist? I just couldn't do it anymore. I stood up abruptly, grabbed my purse, and told him I was paying and leaving. I didn't even wait for him to react. I could feel his eyes on me as I walked to the counter to pay for my meal, but I wasn't about to deal with whatever weirdness he was trying to pull. I paid for my meal, grabbed my receipt, and walked straight out the door, not looking back. As I stepped outside, I had this horrible mix of disbelief and frustration. Was that really a date? Was that seriously how this was going to go down? And who in their right mind thinks it's okay to put food in someone else's purse? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a bad date, and to forget about it. but there was something about the whole thing that just made me feel off. Like maybe he was a lot more messed up than I realized. When I got home, I opened my purse. I really wasn't expecting to find much, but sure enough, there were at least 3 onion rings and some sticky sauce stuck to the lining. I had to clean it out, but honestly, I couldn't even be mad at that point. It was just so ridiculous that it was almost funny. I never did talk to Edwin again. I didn't block him or anything. I just let it fade. Some things you don't need to explain. They just stand on their own as reminders of why certain people don't belong in your life. That's the last time I let a guy take me to a buffet. I had a lot of first dates in my life, but this one, it'll stick with me forever. It was supposed to be simple. I met Jason on a dating app, and for the first few days of texting, things were smooth. We clicked pretty fast. We both loved movies, had the same taste in music, and even had similar senses of humor. It seemed too good to be true, but I didn't overthink it. We made plans to meet at a trendy little restaurant downtown. It was the kind of place that felt fancy but wasn't over the top, just right for a casual dinner date. I showed up a little early and I could see him waiting outside the restaurant. Jason looked exactly like his profile pictures, maybe even better in person. He had that nice clean look about him, sharp but not too polished. We waved at each other, and I could feel a small spark of excitement. I was actually looking forward to this. Maybe this could be the one. The hostess showed us to our table, and we started chatting like we already knew each other. The small talk was easy, and the conversation flowed well. But as the night went on, I started noticing something strange. Every few minutes, Jason would glance down at his phone. Not just a quick look either. He was checking it constantly, tapping away on the screen, completely absorbed in whatever was going on. It started to bug me. I mean, we were on a date, right? Shouldn't he be paying attention to me? I didn't want to say anything at first. Maybe he was just texting his friends or whatever. It's 2023, people are always on their phones. But it started happening so frequently that I began to feel like I was just some background noise to whatever was more important on his screen. I tried not to let it bother me. Then something caught my eye. When Jason finally set his phone down, he left it face up on the table. Normally, I wouldn't be snooping, but something in me made me glance at the screen. The notification preview was just barely visible, just enough for me to make out a few words. I saw my name. It wasn't our conversation. In fact, it looked like he was texting someone else. A different conversation. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. My name wasn't all that uncommon, so I figured it was someone else named Sarah or something. But then, as I kept looking, I saw it. The text didn't just mention my name, it mentioned something that hadn't even happened yet. Something I hadn't said. I hadn't even thought it, but there it was in the preview. She'll ask about the movie next. My heart kind of skipped a beat. That was odd, right? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was just overthinking. I looked up at Jason, trying to keep things normal. He was still busy with his phone, tapping away at something. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't want to make things weird, so I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. And then it happened again. As I started talking about a movie I had seen recently, I noticed Jason's phone buzzing again. He picked it up, and I caught another glimpse of the screen. This time, I could make out the words, "She'll bring up the movie now." My stomach dropped. There was no way. I hadn't even finished the sentence yet, and the message was already predicting it. How could someone know I was about to bring that up? At this point, I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I being paranoid? Maybe. But the longer the night went on, the more the messages seemed to predict what I was going to say. It was like Jason already knew my thoughts before I even voiced them. The more I tried to pay attention to the conversation, the more I noticed how bizarre it all was. Every time I hesitated for a second to think about what I wanted to say, there would be another notification, another prediction. It was like he had a script to follow. He wasn't even listening to me. He was just waiting for the next line to pop up on his phone. I remember talking about my job at one point. I had just gotten a promotion, and I mentioned it casually. And right on cue, Jason's phone buzzed again. She'll talk about her promotion now. I stared at the screen wide-eyed. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. I felt like I was in some sort of twisted game, and Jason wasn't the player. He was just reading off the script. I started feeling trapped. The place was crowded, and I could feel my palms swaying. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to keep playing along. I couldn't understand what was happening. Was this a prank? Was he recording me or something? I kept trying to act normal, but I could barely focus on the conversation anymore. I was just waiting for the next message to pop up on his phone. Then the weirdest part came. Jason looked up at me, smiled, and said, "You're about to ask about my job next, right?" I froze. It wasn't a prediction anymore. He knew exactly what I was going to say. How? How the hell did he know that? I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out. I just stared at him. He was still grinning, as if everything was normal. I couldn't sit there anymore. I needed air. I grabbed my purse, stood up quickly, and made my way to the door. I heard Jason call out my name, but I didn't stop. I pushed through the crowd and out into the cool night air. My mind was spinning. Was that a joke? Some kind of weird trick? Or was I actually losing my mind? I stood outside for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know what to think. Was I overreacting? Had he somehow seen the same exact text predictions I had? Or was it something darker? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like Jason had known everything about me before I even said it. I walked to my car, still in shock, and didn't look back. I didn't block him or anything. I just let it go. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, and frankly, I didn't want to. It was like a bad dream, and I didn't want to wake up and find out it was real. I haven't heard from him since that night. Maybe I dodged a bullet. Maybe I'll never know what was really going on. But I can tell you one thing. I'll never look at my phone the same way again. I was really excited for my date with Daniel. We had met on a dating app, and the chats we had were decent. Nothing super deep, but we shared some similar interests. I liked that he was into photography, and we both loved the same obscure Netflix shows. It felt like we were off to a good start. So when he asked me to meet up for coffee, I was looking forward to it. Coffee's easy, right? Low pressure, just a casual way to get to know someone. When I walked into the cafe, I saw him right away. Daniel looked just like his pictures. Tall, decent smile, kind of unassuming. But the first thing I noticed was that he didn't stand up to greet me when I walked over. He just kind of nodded like we had already known each other forever. A little weird, but no big deal, I thought. Maybe he was just shy. We sat down and I started talking. I always try to fill the silence when I'm with someone new. It's a weird thing I do, I guess. But Daniel didn't seem bothered. He just looked at me, nodded occasionally, and sipped his coffee. Every now and then, I'd ask him a question, but his responses were short. "Yeah, I like that show too." "I haven't been to that park, but it sounds nice." That kind of thing. It wasn't exactly a conversation, more like a series of facts being passed between us. The silence was uncomfortable, but I pushed through. I was about to give up just because the guy wasn't super chatty on the first date. So I kept talking. I told him about my job, my favorite weekend activities, how I've been learning to cook more lately. Honestly, I was rambling a bit, but I didn't care. It was fine, right? Maybe he was just nervous. We've all been there. But then, right in the middle of my rambling, Daniel asked me if I wanted to go for a walk in the park. I was caught off guard for a second because we were just getting started, but I didn't want to seem weird about it. "Sure," I said. A walk might help him open up a little, I thought. A change of scenery might break the tension. We left the cafe and started walking toward the park nearby. It was a small park, nothing fancy, but it had a nice path through some trees and a little pond. We walked side by side for a while, and at first it felt normal, but the longer we walked, the weirder it got. Daniel didn't say a word, not a single thing. I'd ask him questions, try to make small talk, but nothing. No, yeah, no, not even an eye roll or a smile to acknowledge me. He just kept walking, his face completely expressionless. It was like I wasn't even there. I would glance over at him, and his eyes were just staring ahead, focused on nothing in particular. I tried to tell myself he was just shy, that maybe he didn't know how to navigate this weird first date stuff, but it was starting to get unsettling. I was walking through this park, talking to myself essentially, and he was just there, silent. Then came the thing that really made me start to freak out. I remember I said something like, "I've always loved walking through parks like this, especially in the fall. The leaves look so pretty this time of year." As soon as the words left my mouth, I heard a soft voice. It was faint, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had just whispered in my ear. The voice was so close that it sent a chill up my spine. But when I turned, no one was there. No one was around at all. I tried to ignore it, but a few steps later it happened again. Another whisper, this time even clearer. She was talking about the leaves. My heart dropped into my stomach. I looked around again, but the park was still empty. Just Daniel and me walking down the path. He was still walking silently beside me like nothing had happened. But I heard that whisper again, this time more distinct. It was like someone was right behind me and I couldn't see them. I stopped for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. Was I hearing things? Maybe it was just the wind or my imagination. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but the whispers didn't stop. It just kept coming, always before I said something. Every time I'd start to speak, there'd be a soft voice behind me, whispering exactly what I was about to say. It's a nice day, isn't it? There's a bench up ahead. She doesn't like it when people are quiet. I looked over at Daniel, but he was still walking, not even glancing at me. His face was as blank as it had been since the start of the walk. It was like he wasn't even aware of the whispers. Or maybe he was. The thought made my skin crawl. What if he knew what I was going to say before I said it? What if he was the one behind the voices? My mind was racing now. Was this some kind of twisted prank? I wanted to stop, confront him, ask if he heard the voices too. But I didn't know what I was dealing with. I didn't know what to think anymore. All I could do was keep walking, my footsteps quickening, my heart beating louder with each whisper. The voices started getting more specific. It started commenting on things I hadn't even said out loud. Things I was thinking. She's scared now. She's starting to freak out. She wants to leave, but she doesn't know how to. I froze. My whole body went stiff. I hadn't said anything. Not even close. But somehow the voice knew exactly what I was feeling. Exactly what I was thinking. At that moment, I couldn't take any more. I turned abruptly, cutting across the path, and started walking back toward the entrance of the park. My pulse was racing. I didn't even look at Daniel anymore. I didn't want to. I couldn't handle it. I didn't hear any more whispers as I walked, but I still felt like someone was watching me. Like someone was right there, just out of my sight. The air felt thick, like something was about to happen. When I reached the park gates, I stopped for a moment and turned around to look back at Daniel. He was standing there, still looking at me without saying a word. He hadn't moved an inch since I started walking back. I didn't know what to do. What could I do? I wasn't going to wait around and find out if he was a psycho or if something worse was going on. I didn't say goodbye. I just turned and walked straight to my car, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. As I drove away, I didn't feel any better. I still had that sense that I wasn't alone, even though I was. I don't know what happened that day. Was it some kind of weird coincidence? A trick? Or something far stranger? All I know is that after that date, I never reached out to Daniel again. And I made sure to keep an eye out for any whispers, just in case. It was supposed to be a regular first date, the kind that you don't really think too much about. I met Leo on a dating app, and we'd been chatting for a few days. We had some good back and forth, shared some common interests, and he seemed like a nice enough guy. He suggested we meet at this quiet Italian restaurant downtown, and I thought it was a good choice. Low-key, but still kind of nice, nothing too fancy, just a chill dinner. We agreed to meet at 7 p.m., and when I arrived, Leo was already sitting at the table waiting for me. When I sat down, things started off well. The conversation flowed pretty naturally. We joked about the menu, talked about the food we liked, and he did mention how he'd been coming to this restaurant for years. It felt like one of those good vibe kind of dates, you know? The kind where everything feels right, and you're not worried about awkward silences or strange interactions. But that all changed when an old woman walked up to our table. She wasn't very tall, a little hunched over, and had these deep, tired-looking eyes. Her face was wrinkled like she'd lived a long life, but she didn't look comfortable. She wasn't smiling, but she didn't look angry either, just kind of empty. And when she looked at Leo, her expression shifted to something I can't quite explain. It wasn't anger, but it was close. Sadness, maybe. Or maybe regret. Something heavy. She stood there for a second staring at Leo. Then, out of nowhere, she said something that sent a cold chill through me. "You always come back, don't you?" I froze. Leo's body stiffened, his hand gripping the edge of the table. For a moment, I thought he might actually say something, but instead, he just nodded and told her to leave. There was a sharpness in his voice, like he wasn't just asking her to go, he was demanding it. The old woman didn't argue. She just turned around and slowly shuffled away, as if the encounter hadn't fazed her at all. I didn't know what to think. I assumed she was just some random person who had mistaken him for someone else. Maybe it was a case of bad timing, but the whole thing felt off. Leo didn't say anything after that. It was like he was trying to move past it, so I did the same. I pretended like it didn't happen, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling in my gut. As the night went on, though, I started noticing something strange. Leo kept glancing over at the empty seat where the old woman had been standing. At first, it was subtle, just a quick flicker of his eyes. But then it got more obvious. Every few minutes, he'd look over again, like he was waiting for her to come back or like he expected her to. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help it. It was so odd. It wasn't like he was just casually checking out the surroundings. No, he was looking in that specific spot like he was almost anticipating something. Finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I asked him what that was all about. Who was that woman? Why did she say that? I didn't want to sound too nosy, but I had to know. Leo looked uncomfortable. He didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered to the empty chair again, and I could see him trying to figure out what to say. Finally, he shrugged, like it wasn't a big deal. She's just someone from my past, he said, brushing it off. Nothing to worry about. But the way he said it, like he was avoiding the topic, made me even more suspicious. I felt like he was hiding something, and I hated that feeling. I wanted to press him for more, but there was this strange tension in the air. I didn't want anything worse on the first date, so I dropped it, though it still lingered in the back of my mind. We tried to continue with dinner, but it was hard to ignore the fact that Leo was still acting strange. His eyes kept drifting over to that empty seat, like he was waiting for something, or someone. I had noticed that the longer we were there, the more tense the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the weirdness with the old woman, it was him. He seemed like a different person, more withdrawn, more distant. I didn't know if it was because of the encounter or if something else was going on, but I couldn't ignore it. The food came, and we ate in silence for a while. The whole vibe felt off. I kept wondering if I should leave, if I was just reading too much into things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the woman or the weird comment. It was him. It was like Leo was a completely different person when the old woman was mentioned. The way he tensed up. The way he couldn't seem to focus on anything other than the empty seat. It felt like he was trying to hide something, and it was making me uncomfortable. By the time dessert came, I had decided that I was going to cut the date short. I didn't want to deal with this kind of weirdness anymore, and I didn't want to risk getting dragged into something I wasn't ready for. But before I could say anything, I noticed something even more bizarre. The old woman was standing in the doorway of the restaurant, staring right at our table. I don't know how long she had been there, but I didn't want to look. I didn't want to make eye contact, but it was impossible not to. The second I saw her, I knew she was watching Leo. Her gaze was fixated on him, and for some reason, it felt like the world had stopped. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but it seemed like she was waiting for something. Waiting for him to do something. Leo's face had gone pale. He looked like he had seen a ghost. I didn't even have to ask. I knew it was the same woman from earlier. She hadn't left. She was still here, still watching him. And suddenly, it hit me. Maybe this wasn't just some random encounter. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe this woman wasn't just a stranger from his past. Maybe she was his past. Leo's hand twitched like he wanted to get up and run. He didn't, though. He stayed frozen, staring at the woman as she stared back at him. I had no idea what was going on, but the tension between them was palpable. It felt like the entire restaurant was holding its breath. I couldn't do it anymore. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and made my way toward the exit. I didn't look back at Leo, but I could feel his eyes on me as I left. I didn't even wait for him to say anything. The date was over. I didn't care what he was hiding or who that woman was. I just knew I didn't want to be a part of it. I haven't talked to Leo since that night. I don't know what the hell happened, but I don't need to know. All I know is that some encounters are better left unexplained. I went on a date with Matt, and at first, everything seemed normal. We met at this dive bar down the street, the kind where the lights are dim and the music's just loud enough to make it feel like you're in a movie. The kind of place where you don't need to impress anyone. You can just chill, have a drink, and talk. And that's exactly what we were doing. We ordered beers, talked about random stuff, movies, music, work. It was easy, it was fun. He was cute, funny, seemed down to earth. Honestly, everything was fine. But then there was a moment. One of those moments when you're talking to someone and suddenly you feel like something's off. I was mid-sentence telling him about this hilarious thing that happened at work When I happened to glance over his shoulder, my gaze flicked to the bar behind him, and that's when I froze. There was a woman standing there, tall, blonde, and wearing a tight red dress. She was staring directly at us, and it wasn't just a casual glance. No, it was like she was watching us, and the way she was standing there, it felt like she was waiting for something, or maybe even expecting something. My stomach twisted. I couldn't place it, but I knew that I recognized her face. It was almost like I had seen her before, but I couldn't figure out where. Her eyes were locked on me, and I couldn't look away. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I turned my attention back to Matt, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. He hadn't noticed her. Not once. He was still talking, laughing at something I said, completely unaware of the woman at the bar. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe some acknowledgement, maybe a glance at her, anything to show that he saw her too. But nothing. I figured I'd let it go. It was probably nothing. But as the night went on, the more I couldn't stop thinking about her. I glanced back at the bar every now and then, and though she was still standing, still staring. I tried to focus on Matt, on the conversation, but it was like the woman had cast a shadow over the entire evening. Every time I looked away, I could feel her eyes boring into the back of my skull. I tried to brush it off, but my mind kept racing. Was she a friend of Matt's? An ex, maybe? The longer I watched her, the more convinced I became that she wasn't just some random woman at the bar. She looked too intent, too familiar. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to ask, so I brought it up casually. I made a comment about the woman at the bar and how she kept staring at us. I was trying to make it sound like a joke, hoping Matt would laugh it off and tell me it was nothing. Instead, he just smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made me feel better. It was more like he was trying to brush off the situation. He told me it was nothing, just an ex. She was harmless, he said. She probably just had a few too many drinks, he laughed. She probably didn't even know she was staring. But even as he said it, I could tell something was off. He didn't seem as relaxed as he'd been when we first sat down. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and his voice had this weird edge to it, like he was trying to convince himself that it was no big deal and not just me. Still, I didn't push it. I didn't want to seem like I was making a big deal out of nothing, especially not on a first date. But the longer we stayed, the more it became clear she wasn't leaving. The woman at the bar was still there. She hadn't moved. She was still staring. And now it was starting to feel like she was watching me. Now, that's just me. It felt like the room had gotten colder. The music that had once felt like background noise now felt deafening. My conversation with Matt became a distant hum, as if I was hearing it through water. All I could focus on was that woman, standing there, her eyes never leaving me. Every time I looked up from my drink, I'd find her staring. Every single time. But when I glanced at Matt, he was either completely oblivious or just pretending not to notice. I couldn't tell. But something about the whole thing started to make me feel trapped. I could feel her presence, even when I wasn't looking directly at her. It was like she was in the corner of my vision, like she was getting closer, even though she wasn't. At this point, I started to feel paranoid. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was overthinking things. But my instincts wouldn't let it go. I couldn't stop glancing back at her. I couldn't stop wondering why Matt wasn't acknowledging it. What was he hiding? Why didn't he seem concerned? Eventually, I got up to use the bathroom. I told myself I just needed a minute to clear my head, but even as I walked across the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. And when I passed by the bar, I glanced at her again. Her eyes locked on mine, and for a second I felt that I couldn't breathe. There was something in that look. Something cold and predatory. It was like she was daring me to come closer, daring me to acknowledge her. I turned away quickly and hurried to the bathroom, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that I was just overthinking everything. But when I came back out, I didn't see Matt at the table. He was gone. At first, I thought maybe he had stepped outside for a smoke or was at the bar getting another drink. But as I stood there scanning the room, my eyes caught sight of something that made my heart race. He was talking to her, the one at the bar. She wasn't just staring at us anymore. She was right in front of him, talking to him. They were standing so close that I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the way Matt's body was tense, his eyes darting between the woman and the door. It was like he was trying to make sure I didn't see him talking to her. Something snapped inside me. I wasn't going to sit there pretending everything was normal. I grabbed my things and walked out of the bar, the cool air outside hitting me like a shock to the system. I felt lightheaded like I might pass out. I didn't even care anymore. As I walked to my car, I glanced over my shoulder. I couldn't help it. And that's when I saw her again. The woman, she was standing by the window watching me leave. I don't know why I walked into that night. I don't know what Matt's connection to her was, but I don't need to. I never spoke to him again after that night, and I'm not sure if I ever really want to know what happened between them. Some things, I guess, are better left unknown. I've been on my fair share of first dates, but none of them were like the one with Derek. When we first matched on a dating app, he seemed like your typical charming guy. We exchanged a few messages, shared some laughs, and decided to meet at a trendy restaurant downtown. The place was known for its mood lighting and overpriced cocktails, but the food was decent. I figured it would be a low-pressure way to get to know each other better. When I walked in, he was already waiting for me at the bar, sipping on something that looked like an old-fashioned. He looked just like his pictures, tall, dark hair, kind of brooding but with an easy smile that put me at ease. We exchanged a quick hug, and then the hostess led us to our table. Now, this is where things started to get a little weird. As we walked to the back of the restaurant, I noticed something out of place. The table where the hostess was leading us was already occupied, but not by just anyone. A couple sat there, but they looked exactly like us. The woman had dark hair, just like mine, and was wearing a red dress, the same color I had chosen for the evening. The man sitting across from her was wearing a black shirt and dark jeans, exactly like Derek. They were seated in the exact same way we were about to sit. He was on the left, she was on the right. It wasn't just a vague resemblance, it was uncanny. They could have been us, only a few years older. I froze in place trying to figure out what was going on. I glanced at Derek, but he didn't seem fazed. He just kept walking, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The hostess led us to the same table, right next to them, and I couldn't help but feel like this was all some kind of mistake. I stopped walking and pointed it out to the hostess. "That table's already taken," I said, hoping it was just a mistake. "Maybe there's another table." She just smiled at me like I had said something funny. "This table's reserved for two," she replied, her voice too calm, too rehearsed. I wanted to ask more questions, but Derek just waved it off. "It's fine. Let's just sit down," he said, settling into his seat like everything was perfectly normal. But nothing about this felt normal. I couldn't stop staring at the couple across from us. They weren't making eye contact with us at all. Their attention locked solely on their food, but it was like they were part of the same scene, and I wasn't sure how to interpret it. The woman, my doppelganger, I guess, looked so much like me, but something about her felt off. She didn't have that same energy, that same nervousness or excitement you might expect on a first date. She was just blank. She had the same posture as me, the same way she held her fork, even the way she tilted her head when she looked at her partner. It was like I was staring at a reflection, but not quite. The longer I looked, the stranger it felt. I tried to distract myself by focusing on Derek. He was talking about his job, but I wasn't really listening. My mind kept wandering back to the couple. I kept thinking that there had to be some explanation for it. Maybe they were actors. Maybe it was some weird coincidence. But the way they sat and the way they moved, it felt like they were us. In a way, it was like we were already seeing the future, but it didn't make any sense. I felt like I was stuck in some parallel universe where everything was the same but wrong at the same time. I'd noticed that Derek hadn't even looked over at the couple. He seemed completely unbothered, completely unaware of what was happening. I glanced over at him, trying to read his face. Was he not noticing how weird this was? How the couple across from us had almost the exact same dynamic. But his face was calm, casual, like we were just two people on a date, sitting at a normal table. He looked at me and smiled, and I forced a smile back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The more I tried to focus on the conversation, the more I realized I couldn't shake this unease. I felt like I was being watched by the couple or the restaurant itself. Every time I glanced back at them, it felt like they were paying attention to me now, and I swear the woman's eyes met mine for a split second. But when I looked back, she was staring blankly again, like nothing had happened. I tried to act like everything was fine, but I couldn't. My hands were shaking slightly as I held my wine glass, and I had to force myself to take a sip. The atmosphere around us felt off, too. The music was too loud, and the air felt thick. It wasn't the usual restaurant buzz. It was heavy, like something was wrong, but no one was acknowledging it. After what felt like an eternity, I leaned in closer to Derek. I had to ask him what was going on. Derek, I said quietly, trying not to make a scene. Do you see them? The couple across from us. He glanced over, but didn't seem shocked. He just looked back at me, smiling. Yeah, they're just people eating dinner. What's the big deal? His response didn't make sense. He didn't see the resemblance. He didn't notice the weirdness of it. I thought maybe I was losing it, but the unease in my stomach wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. The couple never spoke, never made eye contact with us, but it was almost like they were mirroring our every move. Every time I reached for my wine, she reached for her water. When Derek picked up his menu to glance at it, so did the man across from him. It wasn't just the clothes, it wasn't just the physical appearance, it was the actions, the gestures, the tiny repetitive movements that made it feel like we were stuck in some creepy version of deja vu. Finally, after what felt like hours, the couple dived to leave. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but as they walked past us, I couldn't help but notice something even stranger. The woman, the one who looked like me, didn't even look at me as she passed. Not a glance, not a flicker of recognition, just a blank stare ahead. It felt like she wasn't even aware of me, as if we were two completely different people, but somehow the same. I didn't know what to do. The weirdness of the situation was overwhelming. Derek kept talking about something completely unrelated, but I wasn't really hearing him anymore. I was just thinking about the couple. Were they connected to us? Were we them? I looked at Derek again, trying to make sense of it all. But in that moment, I realized something. I had no idea who he really was. Was he in on this? Was this part of some weird game? He was still smiling, still saying things I wasn't processing, but I didn't feel like I was on the same page anymore. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I could go back. We finished our dinner and I paid the check, but I didn't feel right. I didn't feel like I was leaving a normal first date. I felt like I had just experienced something I wasn't meant to understand. I didn't look back at the couple as I left, but I swear as I passed the table, I could feel their eyes on me. I haven't spoken to Derek since. I don't think I'll ever be able to explain what happened that night. But one thing's for sure, I'm not going back to that restaurant, and definitely not going back to that table. I don't usually do the whole dating app thing, but I figured why not? It wasn't like I had a ton going on anyway, so when Kyle and I matched and hit it off, I figured a chill first date at a bar was the way to go. It was laid back, nothing fancy, and it seemed perfect for getting to know someone without any pressure. The place was exactly what I'd expected. Hidden lighting, an upbeat playlist in the background, and the usual mix of college students and regulars nursing their drinks. It was the kind of spot where you could sit back, enjoy a beer, and just talk. And that's what we did. Kyle was exactly like his profile. Tall, athletic build, a little quiet at first, but super easy to talk to once the conversation got going. We started with the usual small talk, where we grew up, what we did for work, favorite foods, the standard stuff. Nothing weird. In fact, everything felt so normal I started to relax. I wasn't worried I wasn't overthinking it. I just thought, hey, this guy seems cool. But then, about halfway through the night, things started to shift in a way I couldn't explain. We were talking about travel when his phone rang. I didn't think much of it at first. People they called all the time. But when I glanced over at the screen, I saw the name Emma flash up. It didn't mean anything to me. Maybe a friend or an ex, I figured. He quickly silenced it, way too quickly though. Almost like he didn't want me to see it, like he was hiding something. It was weird, but I brushed it off. No need to make a deal out of it, right? We kept talking, and I barely thought about it until a few minutes later. The phone rang again, and I noticed the same name on the screen, Emma. This time, Kyle didn't even glance at it. He just stared at the table, letting it ring. I could tell he was trying to act casual, but there was something in the way his fingers tapped nervously on his glass. Something in his body language that told me he was uncomfortable. It rang again, and again. It didn't stop. Each time it rang, Kyle looked more and more tense. His posture shifted. His leg jittered under the table, and I could see him glancing at the phone like he was waiting for it to stop ringing. But it didn't. It just kept going, like the universe had decided it was going to make his night as uncomfortable as possible. I could tell he was trying to ignore it, but I wasn't going to let it slide. I was getting weirded out. Who calls that much? Especially if it's just a friend, as he had claimed. I waited for a break in the conversation before I finally asked, "Who's calling so much?" Kyle hesitated, just for a second before saying, "Just an old friend." I didn't buy it. There was something in his voice, Something about the way his eyes shifted away from mine that made me suspicious. I wanted to press him more, but I didn't want to come off as rude. So I let it go, figuring I could just ask him again later when things felt more natural. But then the phone rang again. This time, he didn't even pick it up or silence it. He just let it ring, letting it buzz on the table between us. I felt the tension thick in the air, but I didn't say anything. Kyle was visibly uncomfortable now, his fingers gripping the glass so tightly that I was worried it might break. He looked like he wanted to throw the phone across the room. I was starting to get anxious. It was like the phone ringing became some kind of clock, ticking down, pushing us both to a place neither of us wanted to go. I kept glancing between Kyle and the phone, unsure of what to do next. The phone kept ringing, over and over. I started getting frustrated. The constant buzzing was starting to get under my skin. I tried to focus on the conversation again, but it was like my attention was split. I couldn't ignore the noise. I couldn't ignore the fact that every time the phone rang, Kyle seemed to shrink back just a little more, like he was being cornered. Finally, after what felt like the 100th ring, Kyle reached for his phone, but instead of answering it, he turned it face down on the table. He sighed, a long, exasperated breath that sounded like he was trying to talk himself down from something. He didn't say anything about the calls. He just stared at the phone like he was daring it to ring again. At this point, I was over it. I had to ask again, "Is that Emma? Why won't you just talk to her?" He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to the side. He didn't respond right away, and I could see him scrambling for the right words. When he finally did speak, it was quiet, almost a murmur. "It's not that simple." His answer didn't make sense. Not that simple. What wasn't simple? He could have just answered it, right? He could have told me the truth, whatever it was. But something was off, and I could tell he wasn't telling me the whole story. I was starting to feel like I was sitting in a movie where everything was slightly off kilter. The music in the background suddenly sounded louder, more jarring. The people around us seemed farther away. The buzz of the phone was becoming a pulse in my ears. I kept looking at Kyle, watching his hands tense up, his eyes darting to the door as if he was waiting for someone to come in and rescue him. The phone rang again, louder this time, and I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, abruptly, and grabbed my purse. I didn't want to make a scene, but the way Kyle was acting, the way he kept avoiding my questions, it was too much. I started walking away from the table, and Kyle scrambled to stand up, but I didn't look back. I could hear his voice calling after me, but I didn't want to hear it. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I wasn't going to stick around to figure it out. I walked out into the street, feeling a rush of cold air hit me as I stepped outside. I didn't care about the date anymore. I didn't care about Kyle. All I could think about was the phone, the constant ringing, and the way Kyle's face twisted every time it went off. I didn't even bother looking back at the bar as I walked away. The whole evening had taken a turn I couldn't explain, and I didn't need to. Some things just didn't feel right. And whatever was going on with Kyle and those calls, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I never heard from him again, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. Some things, I guess, are better left unanswered. I'd been texting Jared for a few days before we decided to meet up. His messages weren't anything out of the ordinary, just the usual back and forth, a few compliments, a lot of laugh emojis. I thought, why not? He seemed like someone who'd be easy to talk to. I was ready to get back out there after a couple of months of just not doing anything. We picked a local bar. Nothing fancy, just a laid-back place where the drinks weren't too overpriced and there was decent music playing in the background. The kind of bar that's cozy enough to make you feel comfortable but not so quiet that you feel awkward sitting there alone. When I first walked in, I saw him right away. Jared was sitting at a corner table, hunched over, glancing at his phone. He looked exactly like his photos, dark hair, solid build, casually dressed in a leather jacket and jeans. He looked nice enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him from the moment I sat down. It was like his eyes were too focused on me, like he was trying to figure me out. I don't know, I was just nervous too. At first, the conversation went fine. We talked about the usual stuff, work, hobbies, favorite shows, that kind of thing. But slowly, I started to notice that Jared was getting closer to me. It wasn't like he was leaning in to hear me better. It was more like he was crowding my space, pulling his chair just a little too close. Every time I tried to shift back in my seat to give myself a little room, he mirrored my movement and leaned in even more. It wasn't casual. It was calculated. I had to physically readjust myself at one point just to get away from his face. It felt like there was no personal boundary between us anymore. The worst part wasn't even that, though. It was how he started talking over me. He'd interrupt mid-sentence, but not in a way that made me feel like we were just having an active conversation. No, it was almost like he was trying to overpower me, like he needed to control the flow of the conversation. His tone would get louder whenever I started speaking, as if he was trying to dominate the moment. I'm not someone who normally gets uncomfortable in social situations. I've been on enough dates to know how to manage myself. But with Jared, it was like a knot was tightening in my stomach every time he interrupted. Every time he leaned in too close. At one point, I felt his hand brush the back of my neck. It wasn't a casual touch, like someone brushing against you by accident. It was deliberate, lingering even. I don't know if he even realized how long it lasted, but it felt like an eternity. My skin crawled. I shifted in my seat, but he didn't pull away. He just stayed there, his hand still resting on my neck, as though he was claiming it, marking his territory. I could feel my breath quicken as I realized I needed to get out of there. Fast. I wasn't the kind of person to bail on a date early, but the longer I sat there, the more I felt like I was stuck in a weird game I didn't know the rules to. I excused myself to the bathroom, and once I was safely inside, I quickly texted my best friend. I asked her to call me with an emergency just so I had a reason to leave. I could feel my pulse racing as I waited for her to reply. Finally, my phone buzzed. She'd called. Perfect timing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I wasn't exactly sure what was happening, but I knew I needed to get out of there. The energy in that room felt wrong now. It was suffocating. I wasn't even halfway through my drink, but I didn't want to wait any longer. When I came back from the bathroom, Jared was sitting there, staring at the table, his hands folded in front of him. His gaze shifted up when I approached, and I noticed he wasn't even looking at me like a normal person. His eyes weren't worn. They were cold, calculating, like he'd been watching me for the entire 5 minutes I was gone. He didn't even move when I sat back down. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he was trying to figure me out, or worse, like he had figured me out already and was just waiting for me to make a mistake. It was like being under a microscope, and I couldn't breathe. I tried to pretend everything was fine. I took a sip of my drink, but my hand was trembling. I looked around the bar, trying to distract myself from the feeling of being trapped. The bar was still loud, with people chatting and laughing, but everything felt muffled, like I was underwater. My mind kept racing, trying to find an excuse to leave. But every time I thought about standing up, I felt like I was moving in slow motion, like my legs wouldn't work properly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I just knew I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I told Jared I wasn't feeling well. He didn't seem surprised. His eyes were still locked on me, his face expressionless. I didn't even bother finishing my drink. I grabbed my purse, stood up, and left. I didn't look back as I walked out the door. I could feel his eyes on me the entire way out. I didn't even care if he followed me. I just needed to get out of there before I lost my nerve completely. As soon as I was outside, I called a cab. I didn't know why, but the whole night felt like something I couldn't shake. I didn't even want to tell anyone about the date. I didn't want to sound crazy, but in my gut, I knew something wasn't right about Jared. I never heard from him again, and honestly, I'm glad. That night was enough to make me realize that not every date is as harmless as it seems. Some people hide too much under the surface. Some people cross lines that shouldn't be crossed, and they don't even realize it. I still get this uneasy feeling when I think about that night, though. The way he kept pushing into my space, how he wouldn't let go of the conversation, the way his eyes stayed locked on me even after I'd walked away. It's like he was studying me, like he had some weird ownership over me, even when we were just talking. I don't know if he was aware of it, but I certainly was, and I'd rather not find out what would have happened if I'd stayed longer. I've been on a few first dates before, but nothing like this one. I met Michael at a local cafe, a place that seemed calm enough. It wasn't too busy, the smell of fresh coffee and pastries hanging in the air. The vibe was chill, and I figured it would be an easy date. Just grab a drink, chat, see where things go. We'd been texting for a few days, and everything seemed fine. He was friendly, a little quiet at times, but nothing alarming. But as soon as we sat down at our table, I felt something shift. Michael was already there when I arrived, sitting across from me with a slight smile on his face. We exchanged greetings and I ordered a coffee. He asked me how my day had been, and we started with the usual small talk. For the first few minutes, things seemed normal. We were talking about hobbies, work, and life in general. He was engaging enough, although there was something off. A little too eager to keep the conversation going, but I didn't think much of it. Then it happened. I noticed that Michael had stopped talking. At first, I thought maybe he was just pausing, thinking of what to say next. But the pause stretched and stretched. It wasn't the kind of comfortable silence you get when you're hanging out with someone, waiting for the other person to speak. No, this was different. It felt heavy, like he was waiting for something from me, something I wasn't sure I could give. His eyes didn't leave mine, not even once. I shifted in my seat, trying to make the silence less awkward, but it was impossible. The more I tried to glance around or look down at my coffee, the more he seemed to lean in, even though his body didn't move. It was like he was locking me into this weird gaze, and I couldn't escape it. Every time I tried to look away, I'd feel his eyes following me, and I would quickly turn my focus back to his face. His eyes were intense, like he could see right through me, like he was expecting me to do something. I tried to fill the silence. I asked about his day, hoping that would break the tension. I mean, come on, we were just two people having coffee, right? But he didn't respond. It wasn't that he didn't hear me. It was like he didn't care. He just kept staring at me, his lips slightly parted, like he was waiting for me to speak again. I felt this knot in my stomach, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the silence. It was something more, something in the air that I couldn't quite place. His eyes were still locked on mine, and I was starting to feel like he was pulling me into some kind of trance. I blinked rapidly, trying to break free from the pull of his stare, but it was like my body was frozen and I couldn't look away. I finally asked him if he was okay, worried that maybe something was wrong. He nodded, but his expression didn't change. There was no warmth, no reassurance, just this cold, steady gaze. I tried to give him a small smile, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just tilted his head slightly to the side, as if analyzing my face. It got even weirder when I shifted again, trying to get comfortable. I had to move. There was this strange pressure building up in my chest, like I was being suffocated. As soon as I made the slightest adjustment, Michael did the same thing. He leaned in just a little more, and I felt the space between us shrink. He wasn't touching me, not physically, but it felt like he was closing in on me mentally, emotionally. Like I was trapped in that small space with him, and there was no way out. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe he was just shy. Maybe he was awkward like me. Maybe it was some weird power dynamic I didn't understand. But then I saw something in his eyes, something that felt too calculated, too intentional. It was like he was studying me, analyzing every movement I made, waiting for me to slip up, and it scared the hell out of me. The silence stretched on longer, and I couldn't take it anymore. I was starting to feel like I was suffocating. The air felt heavy, like it was thick with tension. I excused myself to the bathroom, hoping to collect my thoughts and calm down. I couldn't stay there much longer. My heart was racing, my palms were sweating, and every second felt like an hour. As I walked into the bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't recognize the person looking back. I was supposed to be on a date, having a nice time, but instead, I felt like I was stuck in some weird, uncomfortable situation I couldn't get out of. I texted my friend, asking her to call me with some kind of emergency, just so I had an excuse to leave. I didn't care if it was dramatic, I needed an out. When I came back from the bathroom, I knew I had to get out of there. Michael was still sitting exactly where I had left him, his eyes still fixed on me. He hadn't moved an inch. His expression hadn't changed. He was waiting, and I knew deep down that whatever it was that was making me so uncomfortable, it wasn't just a weird moment. There was something darker under the surface. I made the decision then and there. I couldn't stay. I had to go. I tried to act casual, like everything was fine, but my heart was pounding. I reached for my bag, paid the bill quickly, and stood up. Michael didn't move. He didn't even flinch when I stood up and grabbed my things. He just kept staring. As I walked out of the cafe, I could still feel his eyes on me. I kept my head down, trying to move as quickly as possible without making it obvious. The door shut behind me with a soft click, but I felt like his gaze followed me all the way to my car. I didn't even check if he was still in the cafe. I didn't want to know. I drove home in a daze, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The whole thing felt like a bad dream. But the worst part, I never heard from Michael again. Not a text, not a call, nothing. It was like he disappeared. I don't know if he was just a weird guy who couldn't handle a simple date, or if something was off about him in a way I'll never fully understand. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget that feeling. The way he locked eyes with me and never broke the silence. The way he seemed to be studying me, waiting for me to slip up. And I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked out. I met Kevin through a dating app, and at first, everything seemed pretty standard. He seemed like a nice guy. He had that charming, slightly awkward vibe, but it was endearing. We decided to meet at a cozy little cafe downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick walls, string lights, and too many types of lats on the menu. It was quiet enough for conversation, but not so quiet that it felt like we were on display. The kind of place where you could really get to know someone, if that makes sense. The first few minutes were perfectly normal. We talked about work, our hobbies, how long we'd been on the app, and all that usual first date stuff. But then, out of nowhere, he asked me a question I wasn't ready for. What's your deepest fear? It threw me off at first. It wasn't the kind of question I expected on a first date. I laughed off. I figured he was just trying to be deep or quirky or whatever. I gave a half-hearted answer, something about spiders, which is true, but come on. Everyone says that. He nodded thoughtfully, but then he didn't move on. He asked me again, this time with more intensity. What's your deepest fear? I thought maybe he didn't hear me, so I repeated my answer, joking that I was terrified of running into an ex while grocery shopping. He didn't laugh. He just stared at me, his eyes narrowing. Seriously, what's your deepest fear? By this point, I started to feel uncomfortable. Was he just trying to make me uncomfortable, or was there something more going on here? Maybe he was just a little socially awkward and didn't know how to keep the conversation flowing. So I gave him another answer, one I thought would get us back on track. The fear of losing people I care about. He seemed satisfied with that, nodding as if he was processing it. But then he asked again, what's your deepest fear? Now I was getting a little creeped out. Why was he asking me this? Why so many times? I glanced around the cafe, hoping to catch the eye of the barista or someone else, just to break the tension. But no one seemed to notice. It was just me and him. I tried to laugh it off, but I could feel my pulse quickening. I already answered that, I said, shifting in my seat. But he didn't respond. He just stared at me, waiting. It felt like I was on trial, and he wasn't going to let me go until I gave the right answer. I felt trapped. I wasn't sure what kind of game he was playing, but I wasn't here for it. I tried to change the subject. I asked about his childhood or what he liked to do for fun, but he ignored me. His eyes never left my face. He was like a hawk, waiting for me to crack. I gave him a confused smile, trying to be polite. What's your deepest fear, then? I asked, hoping to turn the tables. Maybe if I played along, he'd stop. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, eyes boring into mine. You don't get it, do you? He said. I froze. Something in the way he said it made my skin prickle. This wasn't a casual conversation anymore. This was something else. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I thought about just getting up and leaving, but I didn't want to make a scene. I glanced around again, but the cafe still felt empty. I cleared my throat, trying to regain control. Okay, well, it's been fun, but I think I should probably go, I said, standing up. I wasn't sure if it was my nerves, but my voice felt small in my own ears. That's when it got worse. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He just sat there staring at me. You're not leaving until you answer me, he said, his voice low but firm. I looked at him, trying to gauge if he was joking, but his expression was all wrong. It was like something inside him had clicked, like the friendly, charming guy I met was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I tried to step away, but I felt that I couldn't. His eyes were locked on me, and the space between us felt too tight, like I was suffocating. I took a deep breath. I don't know what you want me to say, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I don't have any other fears I need to share with you. He didn't break eye contact. Then he leaned in just a little, and his voice dropped even lower. Everyone has a deep fear. You just have to admit it. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The whole situation felt so surreal, like I was living in a nightmare where I couldn't escape. He didn't seem angry, but there was something cold in his eyes, something that wasn't right. I had no idea what he wanted from me, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my bag, practically knocking over my chair as I rushed to the door. The entire time, I could feel his eyes on me, still watching me as I fled. Once I was outside, I stood there for a second, catching my breath. I looked around trying to steady myself. The night air felt oddly comforting after the tension of the cafe. I pulled out my phone and texted my best friend, telling her everything had gone wrong and needed to talk. I couldn't even finish my coffee. I didn't get a message from Kevin for the rest of the night. No apology, no follow-up. Nothing. I could only think about that weird, intense stare and the way he asked the same question over and over again. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something darker. Something almost expectant. It's been a few days since the date, but I can't stop thinking about it. I keep wondering if I was just overreacting, if maybe it was all just some weird misunderstanding. But deep down, I know I wasn't. I felt it. I'm never going on a date with someone who keeps asking me about my deepest fears ever again. I had a weird gut feeling the moment I walked into the bar. I had been talking to Seth on a dating app for a few days. We exchanged a bunch of messages, and I thought we were hitting it off. So when he suggested meeting up at a local bar to see if there was any chemistry, I figured why not. It seemed casual, right? No pressure. Just a fun date. But when I stepped inside, things were off immediately. The place wasn't super packed, but there were definitely a lot of people hanging around. I looked around for Seth, expecting to see him waving me over, but instead I saw four other women sitting together at one of the high-top tables, chatting and laughing. I froze in the doorway. Something didn't sit right with me, but I pushed it to the back of my mind and figured maybe they were just some of his friends. Seth walked up to me a moment later, a confident grin plastered on his face. He had this kind of smug energy, and it made me uncomfortable right away. But again, I told myself I was probably overthinking it. "Hey, you made it," he said. All charm, no awkwardness. He gave me a quick hug and led me over to the table. The four women stared at me as we walked past. They all looked vaguely familiar, and I suddenly realized they were the other women I'd seen on his profile. I knew that feeling of recognition, like I'd seen their pictures pop up on my feed too. Seth didn't sit down right away. He looked at all of us like he was sizing up an audience, and then, without skipping a beat, he told us to sit. "All right, ladies, here's the deal. You all know why you're here. I've been talking to you on the app, but tonight we're going to see who's the best match. There's only one spot for me, and we're going to make this interesting," he said, sitting down with a confident smirk. At first, I thought I misheard him. It sounded like some joke that was about to get awkward, but then he just went on like it was completely normal. "I know I told all of you we were just meeting up for drinks, but I wanted to be upfront with you. I've been talking to a few girls on the app, and I'm not really sure who I'm vibing with yet. So I thought we could make things interesting. Let's have a little competition. See who really wants to be with me," he continued. My stomach dropped. Something about the way he said it felt wrong. And not just like bad date wrong. It felt like he had a whole other plan in mind. The other women looked equally uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. I could feel the tension rising, and it was like nobody knew what to do except pretend this was normal. Seth looked over at us, grinning like he was waiting for us to go along with it. "All right, so the first challenge is simple," he said, clearly enjoying himself. "We'll see who the best kisser is. Whoever wins gets the first round of drinks with me." I was in complete shock. I literally couldn't process what he was saying. Kissing? Was he serious? And why on earth would he think this was okay? I looked at the other women, and they didn't seem to react the way I expected. No one was calling him out. No one was leaving. It was like they were all silently agreeing to go along with this messed up idea. That's when I realized this wasn't a date. This wasn't a casual meetup. Seth had set up some kind of twisted game, and we were all the pieces. I could feel my face getting hot, not from embarrassment, but from anger. I wasn't going to play his game. I glanced over at the other women again, who were sitting in silence, unsure of what to do. At that point, I just couldn't stand it anymore. I knew what I had to do. Without saying a word, I grabbed my drink and tossed it right into Seth's face. The cold splash of water hit him square in the chest and face, and for a moment he just froze. His smirk disappeared as he wiped his face with his hand, looking more surprised than angry. I wasn't the only one. One of the other women got up and did the same. Another one followed, and before I knew it, the whole table had thrown their drinks at him. No one said anything. No one needed to. We all just knew that we weren't playing his stupid game. Seth's face went from shock to pissed in an instant. He stood up, knocking his chair back. But we weren't sticking around to let him say anything else. Without a word, we'd all turned and walked out of the bar, leaving him standing there in front of the table, drenched and speechless. Once we were outside, I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline rush finally leaving my body. I couldn't believe that just happened. I still couldn't process it. I'd never been on a date that turned into a competition for a guy's attention. I felt like I had just walked out of some messed up game show, except there was no prize for winning. The prize was just him, and honestly, that wasn't something I wanted anyway. The other women walked with me for a little while. We didn't say much, but there was a kind of unspoken understanding between us. None of us wanted to stick around and see what Seth had planned next. We all agreed on one thing: he wasn't worth fighting over. He wasn't worth anything. I'm not going to lie, I had some serious secondhand embarrassment just thinking about how he must have felt when he was standing there, dripping wet and alone while we all walked away. But honestly, it felt good. It felt like taking control back, like I wasn't going to let some guy turn me into a contestant on his creepy game show. That night, I deleted the app and promised myself that I'd never again settle for a guy who saw me like some kind of challenge to win. Seth wasn't the guy I thought he was, and I wasn't going to let him be the guy who wasted my time. I've always been skeptical about dating apps, but when I matched with Thomas, something felt different. His profile was full of witty remarks and thoughtful responses, nothing weird or off-putting. We chatted for a few days, and he seemed like a solid guy. He was polite, kind, and we had similar interests. After a few days of texting, we decided to meet at a small cafe for our first date. I was excited. It seemed like it could turn into something good. When I got there, he was already waiting outside. He looked exactly like his pictures, tall, clean-cut, with this warm smile that made him seem approachable. I felt at ease as we walked inside, found a cozy table in the corner, and ordered our drinks. At first, the conversation was easy. We talked about work, our favorite movies, books, and the usual first date stuff. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something off about the way he was looking at me. It wasn't just the usual glances. He was studying me. Not in a getting-to-know-you kind of way, but more like he was analyzing every movement I made, every word I said. It was like I was some kind of puzzle to him, something he was trying to figure out. I tried not to make a big deal of it. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. But then he said it. "You know, your bones are perfect," he said, his voice soft but intense. I blinked, thinking I misheard him. "Your bones are just perfect," he repeated, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. He wasn't smiling like before, but he wasn't being creepy in the traditional sense either. It was like he genuinely appreciated the structure of my body, like he was looking at me as a piece of art, or worse, a specimen. I was thrown off, but I didn't want to be rude. So I laughed nervously and changed the subject. I asked him about his job, hoping to steer the conversation in a more normal direction, but he didn't take the bait. He just kept staring at me as though he was waiting for something. "You don't realize how interesting your skin is," he added, his tone now much more serious. It's so delicate, but also strong. You're fascinating." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like he wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking about me like I was some object, something he wanted to study. His words were complimenting, but they were so off that they didn't feel like compliments at all. It felt more like he was cataloging me in some twisted way. My gut instinct told me something was very wrong, but I kept trying to brush it off. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe this was how he expressed interest. But the more he talked, the more it felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. He didn't stop there. No, the next thing he said made my blood run cold. He leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't wait to learn every inch of you, every single detail." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't even attraction. It was like he was looking at me the way some would look at an object they wanted to dissect. I felt frozen in place, unable to respond. My stomach churned, but I didn't know how to be out of the situation. He was still smiling, but there was no warmth in it. There was just this intensity, like he was seeing me for something far beyond what I actually was. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But something kept me there, trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as it felt. Maybe I was just imagining it. So I kept nodding, kept trying to engage, kept hoping he would snap out of whatever strange mindset he was in. But as the night went on, I started to feel more and more like a specimen in a lab. I couldn't ignore how his eyes followed every movement I made, how his gaze lingered just a little too long on my hands, my neck, my lips. At one point, I reached for my drink, and he leaned in even closer, his eyes never leaving me. He was so close I could feel his breath on my skin. My hand froze midair. "There's so much to discover," he said, almost reverently, like he was speaking to himself, not me. I wanted to scream, to run out of there, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, locked in this weird moment where everything felt wrong, but I didn't know how to escape. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before things got worse. I made up some excuse about feeling tired and needing to go home. I stood up quickly, gathering my purse, and rushed to pay the bill. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. As I grabbed my coat and made my way to the door, I could still feel his eyes on me. The whole time. His gaze never wavered. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The second I stepped outside, I took a deep breath of cold air, feeling the tension drain from my body just a little. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. I walked to my car, trying to calm myself down, but all I could think about was what he'd said. What he hadn't said. It was like he was a predator studying its prey, and I had been the target the entire time. I blocked his number as soon as I got home. I didn't even want to see any of his messages. I didn't want to risk him showing up at my door, or worse, finding a way to keep watching me. Even now, whenever I think back to that night, I can still feel the weight of his stare. The way his compliments felt more like threats than anything else. I'm not sure what would have happened if I'd stayed longer, but I'm certain I don't want to find out. I don't know what was going through his head, but I never want to meet someone like him again. I asked him how he knew all of these things, how he could say what I was about to say before I said it. Was he just good at reading people? Was he observing me? Or was there something more to it? He just shrugged, the smile never leaving his face. "It's not difficult," he said, almost as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "You just think out loud, even when you don't speak." I was stunned. I didn't know how to react to that. I'd never heard anything like it. I didn't think I was thinking out loud. Was he serious? Was he really hearing my thoughts? I didn't know whether to laugh it off or get up and leave. My mind raced. I felt trapped. There was no way this was normal. I tried to excuse myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to clear my head, but I could still feel his gaze following me the entire time I was gone. It felt like he was watching me through the walls, reading me from the other side of the door. When I came back, he was sitting in the same position, eyes fixed on me like he was waiting for me to speak first. I could feel the weight of his attention, his knowledge pressing on me. I quickly paid the bill, trying to escape before things got worse. My mind was racing as I walked out of the cafe, the cool air hitting my face as I tried to steady myself. I didn't turn back to see if he was following me, but I felt like I was being watched, like his presence was still lingering in my mind. I haven't talked to Thomas since. I blocked him on everything the moment I got home. Every time I closed my eyes, I still heard his voice in my head, finishing my thoughts, reminding me that he could hear me even when I wasn't speaking. It's been weeks, and I can't shake the feeling that he's out there, watching, waiting for me to think too loudly again. I'll never forget the first time I met Adam. I should have known something was off from the moment he greeted me. We'd been chatting online for a few weeks before finally agreeing to meet in person. It wasn't anything special, just a casual coffee date at this quirky little cafe downtown. I wasn't expecting sparks to fly, but I thought it'd be nice to get to know someone new. Adam seemed fine at first. He was charming in a way. He had that easy smile and talked about all the right things: movies, music, travel. He had the kind of confidence that made him seem safe, but there was something beneath it all, something that didn't sit right. I couldn't quite place it. As we sat down at a small table by the window, I noticed that he kept positioning himself closer than necessary. It wasn't a huge thing at first, just a little lean over when he was talking. But then, as the conversation went on, I started noticing other things. The first time it happened, I wasn't sure if it was intentional. He casually brushed his fingers over my hand while reaching for his coffee. I flinched slightly, thinking it was an accident. But then he did it again a few minutes later, this time a little slower, his fingers lingering longer than they should have. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but it didn't stop him. He'd touch my arm, my shoulder, or the back of my neck every time he spoke. It felt like he was trying to claim me, like he thought he had a right to invade my personal space. I could tell that I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to handle it. I shifted in my seat, moving a little farther back, hoping to create some space between us. But Adam didn't take the hint. He leaned in just a little closer, like he was trying to pull me back into his bubble. The worst part was how he didn't seem to notice or care, how I was reacting. It wasn't just a physical thing, it was the way he looked at me. His eyes would stay on mine for longer than felt normal, as if he was studying me, measuring my every response. Every time I tried to break eye contact or look away, he would tilt his head just slightly, making sure I couldn't escape his gaze. It was unsettling. Every time I shifted away from him, he would follow me. I would lean back in my chair, trying to create a little more space, but he would adjust too, inching closer and closer. It wasn't just a nervous thing. He wasn't just trying to make a connection. It felt like he was trying to own the space, like I wasn't allowed to set any boundaries. The moment I knew I had to get out of there was when he brushed his fingers against the back of my neck while I was sipping my coffee. He didn't say anything, just leaned in so close that I could feel his breath against my skin. The touch wasn't gentle, it felt invasive, like he was marking territory, testing how far he could push me. I froze. My stomach twisted in a knot. This wasn't just an awkward first date anymore. It was something else. Something that felt wrong. I shifted again, pulling away, but this time I didn't just move my body. I pulled back emotionally too. I tried to redirect the conversation, but it didn't work. He kept interrupting me, talking over me as if he had the right to finish my thoughts. It was like I was a prop in his world, and the conversation wasn't really about me at all. It was about him, and how much space he could take up, both physically and emotionally. At one point, I tried to glance around the cafe, just to give myself a moment to breathe, but Adam noticed immediately. He leaned even closer, his arm brushing mine as he followed my gaze. His voice lowered like he was trying to create a more intimate atmosphere. It made me want to scream. It wasn't the type of closeness that makes you feel special. It felt suffocating, like there was no escape. I was trying to think of ways to politely excuse myself, but I was trapped. I couldn't get a word in without him interrupting or finishing my sentences. It was like he was so sure of himself, so sure that I had to listen, that I had to accept whatever he was giving. And the more I tried to assert myself, the more he closed in. I needed a break. I needed air. I told him I was going to the bathroom, hoping it would give me enough time to think. As soon as I stood up, I could feel his eyes on me, following me across the room. It felt like a weight on my back. The whole time I was walking to the bathroom, I kept wondering if he was watching me through the reflection in the mirrors, if he was planning what to do next. I'll never forget the first time I met Adam. I should have known something was off from the moment he greeted me. We'd been chatting online for a few weeks before finally agreeing to meet in person. It wasn't anything special, just a casual coffee date at this quirky little cafe downtown. I wasn't expecting sparks to fly, but I thought it'd be nice to get to know someone new. Adam seemed fine at first. He was charming in a way. He had that easy smile and talked about all the right things: movies, music, travel. He had the kind of confidence that made him seem safe, but there was something beneath it all, something that didn't sit right. I couldn't quite place it. As we sat down at a small table by the window, I noticed that he kept positioning himself closer than necessary. It wasn't a huge thing at first, just a little lean over when he was talking. But then, as the conversation went on, I started noticing other things. The first time it happened, I wasn't sure if it was intentional. He casually brushed his fingers over my hand while reaching for his coffee. I flinched slightly, thinking it was an accident. But then he did it again a few minutes later, this time a little slower, his fingers lingering longer than they should have. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but it didn't stop him. He touched my arm, my shoulder, or the back of my neck every time he spoke. It felt like he was trying to claim me, like he thought he had a right to invade my personal space. I could tell that I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to handle it. I shifted in my seat, moving a little farther back, hoping to create some space between us. But Adam didn't take the hint. He leaned in just a little closer, like he was trying to pull me back into his bubble. The worst part was how he didn't seem to notice or care, how I was reacting. It wasn't just a physical thing, it was the way he looked at me. His eyes would stay on mine for longer than felt normal, as if he was studying me, measuring my every response. Every time I tried to break eye contact or look away, he would tilt his head just slightly, making sure I couldn't escape his gaze. It was unsettling. Every time I shifted away from him, he would follow me. I would lean back in my chair, trying to create a little more space, but he would adjust too, inching closer and closer. It wasn't just a nervous thing. He wasn't just trying to make a connection. It felt like he was trying to own the space, like I wasn't allowed to set any boundaries. The moment I knew I had to get out of there was when he brushed his fingers against the back of my neck while I was sipping my coffee. He didn't say anything, just leaned in so close that I could feel his breath against my skin. The touch wasn't gentle, it felt invasive, like he was marking territory, testing how far he could push me. I froze. My stomach twisted in a knot. This wasn't just an awkward first date anymore. It was something else. Something that felt wrong. I shifted again, pulling away, but this time I didn't just move my body. I pulled back emotionally too. I tried to redirect the conversation, but it didn't work. He kept interrupting me, talking over me as if he had the right to finish my thoughts. It was like I was a prop in his world, and the conversation wasn't really about me at all. It was about him, and how much space he could take up, both physically and emotionally. At one point, I tried to glance around the cafe, just to give myself a moment to breathe, but Adam noticed immediately. He leaned even closer, his arm brushing mine as he followed my gaze. His voice lowered like he was trying to create a more intimate atmosphere. It made me want to scream. It wasn't the type of closeness that makes you feel special. It felt suffocating, like there was no escape. I was trying to think of ways to politely excuse myself, but I was trapped. I couldn't get a word in without him interrupting or finishing my sentences. It was like he was so sure of himself, so sure that I had to listen, that I had to accept whatever he was giving. And the more I tried to assert myself, the more he closed in. I needed a break. I needed air. I told him I was going to the bathroom, hoping it would give me enough time to think. As soon as I stood up, I could feel his eyes on me, following me across the room. It felt like a weight on my back. The whole time I was walking to the bathroom, I kept wondering if he was watching me through the reflection in the mirrors, if he was planning what to do next. I went to the bathroom, locked the door behind me, and leaned against the sink, taking deep breaths. My heart was pounding. I hadn't expected the date to feel like this, to feel so heavy. I was trapped in my own head, replaying every moment, wondering where I'd gone wrong. What was I supposed to do now? I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I'd go back to the table and make up some excuse to leave. But when I opened the door to step out, I hesitated. I felt that same dread creeping up my spine. Adam was standing just outside the bathroom, leaning against the wall, waiting for me. As soon as he saw me, he straightened up, the same unreadable look on his face. It wasn't a relief to see him. It felt like being cornered. He wasn't even hiding the fact that he was waiting for me to come back. Without saying a word, I walked past him, quickly heading for the exit. I could feel his presence behind me, close but not close enough to touch. I didn't look back. My only goal was to get out of that cafe, away from him, away from the suffocating air. I could still feel the heaviness of his gaze on me as I pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool evening air. I felt a little bit of relief when the door closed behind me. But even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I thought it'd be fine meeting someone from a dating app. I'd done it before. The whole thing's a bit weird at first, sure, but it's not like I expected fireworks or anything. Just dinner, a low conversation, maybe some laughs. Simple, right? But that's not how it went down with Imran. I got the restaurant first, a cozy little spot on the edge of town with twinkling lights and a soft buzz in the air. It had that quiet charm about it, perfect for a first date. I sat down at the table they'd reserved for us, scrolling through my phone to kill time. I looked up when I heard the sound of footsteps. Imran was standing there, wearing a button-up shirt that looked a little too neat. His hair was a bit too perfect, his smile a bit too wide. He was tall, with sharp features, but there was something about him that didn't feel right. Not in a creepy way, just off. We exchanged pleasantries, and I could tell he was trying too hard to be charming. The smile never quite reached his eyes. It was like he'd studied the art of a smile in a textbook, but couldn't quite pull it off naturally. And yet, every time I made a joke or laughed, he'd give that same wide, empty smile and chuckle just a beat too late. His laughs weren't real, they felt rehearsed, like someone had told him that this is what you do on dates. Smile, laugh, be engaging. But it wasn't real. It never felt real. As the night went on, I kept picking up on little things. His eyes were distant, like they never fully focused on me, just vaguely on my face, like he was waiting for something. He would ask a question, and when I answered, he wouldn't respond the way someone normally would. Instead, he'd pause for a second, then nod slowly, as if processing what I said. His answers, when he did speak, didn't really connect with mine. It was like we weren't having a conversation, just a series of one-sided interactions. At first, I thought maybe he was just shy, and I was reading too much into it. But the more we talked, the more it started to feel like he wasn't even there. He'd smile at the right times, laugh at the right jokes, but it all felt hollow. It wasn't that he wasn't paying attention. He was there physically, but mentally he was miles away. After a while, I started to feel this weird pressure to keep things going, to fill the awkward silences with more conversation. But whenever I paused, he would just look at me, staring with that same fixed blank expression. It wasn't even like he was thinking. He was just there. It made my skin crawl a little, like I was talking to a mannequin that had been dressed up for dinner. And then there was the way he looked at me. Like I wasn't a person but something to be studied, cataloged. He'd tilt his head when I spoke, his eyes scanning my face with a weird intensity that made me want to shrink away. But I couldn't not with him so close. I tried to shift in my chair, but no matter where I moved, he mirrored my movements, always leaning just a little bit closer, his gaze never wavering. At some point, I made a joke off something random. He'd even remember what it was now, like a laugh. His laugh was quick, like it was forced. The thing is, it didn't even seem like he was laughing at the joke. He was laughing at me like he was confirming that this was the right response, like he was checking off boxes. It was unsettling. I noticed that his hand kept twitching like he was about to reach for something, but he never did. It was almost like he was rehearsing moves in his head, didn't know how to act on them. Every time I looked down at my menu or picked up my drink, I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was constant, laser-focused. The kind of stare that makes you uncomfortable, but you can't quite explain why. I decided to test something. I looked at him directly, watched him for a while as he kept talking about his job, his hobbies, all the usual stuff. I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching him. His smile never changed. His hands were resting on the table, not moving. But his eyes looked blank, like they weren't even processing the words coming out of his mouth. He paused every now and then, but only for a fraction of a second, just enough to make you think he was thinking about what he was saying, but it wasn't real. I felt like I was sitting across from someone who wasn't fully human. He was imitating everything, but it felt like he didn't know why or how. It was as if he had read all the books about how to be charming on dates, and he was following the script perfectly, except it wasn't working. I tried to steer the conversation towards something more personal, just to see if I could break through whatever weird wall he put up. But every time I got a little too personal, he'd deflect or shift the topic or just smile at me. It didn't take long for me to realize that I wasn't just having an awkward date. I was stuck in a conversation with someone who wasn't fully there. And that realization hit me like a brick wall. My heart started to race and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that he was still smiling at me like everything was normal, or the fact that I couldn't escape this feeling of wrongness, of something being deeply off. I finally had enough. I stood up, trying to keep my composure, and excused myself to the bathroom. It wasn't even a well-thought-out plan. I just needed a moment to breathe. In the bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror, trying to collect my thoughts. My hands were shaking slightly, but I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm down. When I returned to the table, I found him sitting there, still staring at the spot where I'd been sitting, his eyes unblinking. I could feel the weight of his gaze, even from a distance. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't sit through this date pretending that everything was fine. I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to go. His smile stayed in place, of course, but his eyes, they didn't move. It just did lock on me, still too steady, too focused. As I walked out of the restaurant, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Even now, days later, I can't get the image of his face out of my head. The way he smiled, the way he never seemed to see me, just the idea of who I was supposed to be. It was like he wasn't really human. It was like I'd been talking to a shell the whole time. I never expected a coffee date to go this way. I met Jake on a dating app a few days earlier. From his profile, he seemed pretty normal, funny, cute, and into the same music as me. I was excited to meet up for the first time. Nothing fancy, just coffee at this local cafe I liked. A good, casual vibe. When I walked in, I saw him immediately. He was sitting by the window, wearing a flannel shirt, looking like he belonged in one of those Pinterest hipster coffee shop pictures. He waved when he saw me, and I waved back, feeling that familiar first date flutter in my stomach. everything started out fine. We chatted about music, movies, even work. He seemed easy to talk to, and I thought this could turn into something good. But after a while, I started noticing something. He was different. Not in a huge way, but enough to make me uncomfortable. Out of nowhere, he pulled out his phone. I figured he was just going to check something, maybe text someone. But no, he started fiddling with the camera. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's normal to take a selfie every now and then. But then, without asking, he positioned the phone between us and asked me to look natural. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I just smiled awkwardly, trying to go along with it. I was nervous, you know? It was a first date. But then things got weird. He took one selfie, and another, and another. He kept snapping them, constantly adjusting the angle, trying to get a better shot. Every time I thought it was over, he asked me to hold still for just one more. I started feeling like I was in some sort of weird photo shoot, where I was a prop and he was a photographer, not a date. I shifted in my chair, trying to get more comfortable. But Jake didn't stop. He just kept positioning my face. No, look at the camera. Look at me. Look right here. He was barely even glancing at the camera himself. His focus was entirely on me. Too focused. The way his eyes would flick between the phone screen and my face felt off. Like he wasn't even seeing me, just a model for his shots. I tried to move my face away to look out the window or at my coffee. But as soon as I did, his hand was on my chin, gently but firmly guiding my face back into position. He didn't seem to notice how weird it was getting. It was like he was in his own little world, consumed with getting the perfect shot. I could tell he wasn't just taking photos for fun, though. He was planning something. I could feel it. After a while, I couldn't even focus on our conversation anymore. My brain was just fixated on the phone, on the constant clicking, on his hand hovering close to my face as he fiddled with the camera. At one point, I smiled awkwardly, my cheeks starting to hurt from all the forced expressions. But no matter how I adjusted or tried to break the cycle, he wouldn't stop. I thought he might finally wrap it up after 10 or so pictures, but no. It kept going and going. His eyes didn't look warm or excited. There was no joy in it, just this blank intensity. He was looking at me like I was an object, like I wasn't even a person, but just something he was studying. I felt like I was trapped in this surreal moment where the world outside the cafe didn't exist. It was just him, his phone, and me staring at the camera. Then the worst part happened. Jake held my face in his hand again, this time a little more firmly. He adjusted my chin, tilted my head slightly to the left, and snapped another 15 photos in a row. The whole time he didn't say a word. The only noise was the click of the camera, followed by a couple of quick swipes across his screen. When he finally put the phone down, he looked at me, straight into my eyes, and smiled. But it wasn't a smile like before. This one was colder, almost clinical. He wasn't looking at me like a person anymore. It was like I was a subject in his little experiment. He smiled and said, "These will look great on your future profile." I didn't know what to say. Was he joking? Was I supposed to laugh? He didn't seem to be joking. He just stared at me, waiting for a response. But I was too stunned to even manage a proper reply. I didn't know if I should feel creeped out or if I was being overly dramatic. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get out of there. I tried to keep the situation light. I made a small comment laughing it off, but inside, I was dying a little. This wasn't a date. It felt like I was being turned into some kind of experiment, and I was just his subject. He wasn't interested in getting to know me. He wasn't trying to connect. He just wanted to collect pictures of me, maybe to use for himself, or who knows what else. I started to gather my things, hoping he wouldn't notice how eager I was to leave. I grabbed my purse, making sure I didn't leave anything behind. I didn't know if I could trust him anymore. Did he even care about who I was, or was I just another face for his social media game? Jake didn't stop me. He didn't even look concerned that I was about to walk out. He just smiled that empty smile again, looking at me like I was some piece of art he'd just finished painting. I stood up and made my way to the door as fast as I could without running. My stomach was twisted into knots, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. But just before I stepped outside, I heard him call after me. "I'll send you the pictures soon." I didn't turn around. I just walked straight out into the cool evening air, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. I didn't know what kind of person I had just spent an hour with, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going back to find out. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder, how many other dates had Jake turned into photo ops? How many people had he made feel like nothing more than a prop in his weird little photo shoots? And worse, would he be posting those pictures online, claiming some fake connection to me that never even existed? It was a coffee date gone horribly wrong, and I'd be sure to trust my instincts a little more next time. I thought dinner would be a chill way to get to know someone better, but James turned it into something else entirely. I should have known something was off when we first met. He'd seemed nice enough online, funny, a little quirky, and really into food. He even mentioned on his profile that he was a foodie. I figured, okay, cool, who doesn't like a good meal? But I wasn't prepared for just how intense his food obsession was. We met at a local restaurant I'd been dying to try, a trendy spot known for its seasonal menu and artisan dishes. I was excited, great food, good atmosphere, and maybe a decent date to boot. But as soon as James walked in, I could tell something was different. He didn't look at the menu or glance at the wine list like a normal person. Instead, he scanned the entire room, eyes darting from the plates of other diners to the decor to the staff behind the bar. He almost seemed like he was evaluating everything, checking for something. When we sat down, I tried to start a casual conversation, but he was already too focused on the menu. He pointed out every dish he'd had before and listed his preferences for each one. He even went as far as to mention what he didn't like about the dishes in excruciating detail. The waiter came over to take our order, and that's when things started to go south. James looked at the menu like it was an exam paper he had to pass. He spent an eternity reading over each option before finally turning to the waiter. I thought, okay, maybe he's just really particular. But then he started to go into it, every single detail. The tomatoes in the salad must be sliced a certain way, he said. None of those thick, awkward wedges. It should be thin, but not too thin, just enough to retain some texture. I tried to smile awkwardly, hoping the waiter would just nod and move on, but James wasn't done. He started talking about the steak next. I'd like the steak, but not rare, barely seared. Just a hint of pink inside. And make sure it's from grass-fed beef. If you could ask the chef to use only olive oil from the first press, that would be ideal. I glanced at the waiter, who looked completely lost. He nodded. It was obvious he was struggling to keep up. I was beginning to feel embarrassed, like we weren't on a date anymore, but rather in a chef's critique session. James didn't stop there, though. Oh no, he had more to say. And if you could make sure the mushrooms are sauteed in butter, not oil, it'll really bring out the flavor. The asparagus should be blanched, not overcooked. Still with a little bite, but not so raw that it's unpleasant. Oh, and could I get the dressing on the side? I like to control the amount, you know. I didn't know where to look at this point. I just stared down at my menu, trying to figure out if I should apologize to the waiter or just try to laugh it off. My face felt hot from the awkwardness, but James didn't seem to care. He kept going, detailing the exact temperature the wine should be served at, how the bread should be sliced, and what kind of salt he wanted sprinkled on his dish. It was like he was putting in a special order for a Michelin star restaurant, not this cozy little bistro. The waiter just nodded again, clearly overwhelmed. He made a quick exit, and I could feel my face burning with embarrassment. I tried to make a joke to break the tension, something along the lines of I guess we're getting the VIP treatment tonight. But it didn't help. James just smiled politely, but there was no spark in his eyes. It was like he wasn't really present in the conversation. He was too consumed with his meal, or maybe with himself. Either way, it felt like I was invisible. I couldn't stop thinking about how he was treating the waiter, too. The whole interaction was so transactional. He wasn't there to enjoy a nice meal or a relaxed date. He was there to critique, to micromanage, and to control. It was unsettling, to say the least. As we waited for our food, James continued to drone on about his previous dining experiences. He told me about a 5-course meal he had in Paris where the chef made the lamb just so, and how the dessert was reconstructed to look like an abstract piece of art. I barely managed to get a word in, my attempts at conversation swallowed up by his need to explain the technicalities of everything. When the food finally arrived, it was nothing short of awkward. He inspected his plate like a scientist, rearranging the food as if to make sure it matched his standards. I, on the other hand, just stared at my plate, feeling a wave of discomfort wash over me. I tried to take a bite, but I couldn't focus on the flavors. My thoughts kept drifting back to how ridiculous this whole situation had become. The waiter brought us our drinks, and when James asked for a replacement because his wine was a touch too warm, I couldn't take it anymore. My stomach was in knots, and I felt trapped. This wasn't a dinner date. It was a performance. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to just sit back and endure it or if I should say something. I cleared my throat and tried to make a lighthearted comment, something about how picky he was being, but all I got was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked at me like he was evaluating me and then went right back to inspecting his meal. It was at that moment I realized something. It wasn't just his food preferences that were unsettling, it was the way he controlled everything, the way he dominated the conversation, the way he micromanaged every little detail. I felt small, insignificant, like I didn't matter at all. I wasn't a date to him. I was a spectator in his little world of precision. By the time we finished the meal, I could barely remember what we had talked about. I was just counting the minutes until I could leave without causing a scene. I didn't even want to order dessert. What was the point? When the bill came, I didn't even wait for him to make another remark. I paid my share quickly, gave a half-hearted smile, and made my excuses. I don't even remember what I said to him as I walked out of the restaurant, but I knew I wasn't coming back. Dinner with James was one of the most awkward experiences I've ever had. I didn't feel like I was on a date. I felt like I was a guest at his personal cooking class, one that I never signed up for. It was a total disaster, and as I stepped out into the cool night air, I promised myself I'd never go out with someone so obsessed with controlling everything again. I guess sometimes the perfect meal is just a little too much to swallow. I'll never forget my first date with Tom, not because it was romantic or fun, but because it left me genuinely questioning my judgment. You know when you have a gut feeling that something's wrong, but you can't quite pinpoint it. That's how I felt that night. And the worst part, I ignored it. So here's how it went down. We met on one of those dating apps that were all the rage at the time. Tom seemed pretty normal in his profile. Cute, had a decent job, and a few pictures of him hiking looking all outdoorsy. Nothing about him screamed red flags, so I agreed to meet up. We chose this cozy little cafe downtown, the kind where the walls are covered in old movie posters and the air always smells like cinnamon. It felt like the perfect spot for a first date, low-key, no pressure. When I walked in, I saw him immediately. He was sitting at a small table near the window, wearing a black hoodie and jeans. His eyes locked on mine as I walked toward him, and I gave him a small wave. He smiled, but something about it felt off, like it was a little too wide, a little too eager. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. We said our hellos, I sat down, and we started chatting about the usual stuff. What we do for work, our hobbies, what we like to do in our free time. All pretty standard stuff. But then it happened. We were talking about a documentary I had watched recently. It was about this group of people who lived in isolation for a year, testing how it would affect their mental health. I thought it was fascinating, but also a little sad, seeing how these people struggle with loneliness and the toll it took on them. Tom paused, almost like he was waiting for me to say more. When I didn't, he suddenly burst out laughing. Not just a chuckle, but this loud, full-on laugh that caught everyone's attention in the cafe. I froze, unsure of what had just happened. He kept laughing, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what I had just said. "You think that's sad?" he said, still laughing, almost choking on his own amusement. "Let me tell you about the worst thing that ever happened to me." I didn't want to hear it. In fact, I didn't even ask for this story. But there was something in his eyes, this gleam that made me uneasy. I couldn't look away. So I just sat there and nodding awkwardly, not knowing what else to do. He went on to tell me this incredibly detailed story about his childhood. But it wasn't just a "yeah, my parents were tough on me" kind of story. It was dark, really dark. He talked about how his dad was abusive, how his mom had a breakdown, how he had to raise his younger brother while still a kid himself. All of it came out in this strange mix of humor and bitterness, and what really got to me was how laughing seemed to be his coping mechanism. Everything, no matter how horrible, was just a punchline to him. The worst part? The whole time he was laughing loudly, uncontrollably, like he thought it was all a joke. At first, I was confused, but then it started to feel wrong. How could anyone laugh like that while talking about such traumatic things? And why was I stuck here listening to it? He could see I was uncomfortable, but he didn't care. It was like my discomfort only fueled his amusement. By the time he was done, I felt like I had just listened to a horror story, but it wasn't the kind with monsters or ghosts. It was real. His life sounded like an absolute nightmare, but the way he told it made me question whether he actually believed any of it. It felt like he was trying to prove something to me, but I didn't know what. So yeah, at that point, I was pretty much ready to bail, but I didn't. I was trying to be polite, trying to push past the discomfort, so I asked him about something else. Anything else. He asked me about a book I was reading, and I tried to answer. But as I spoke, I saw it again. That look in his eyes, the grin that was a little too wide. And then he started laughing again. I couldn't take it anymore. Every time I opened my mouth, he'd either laugh or make some weird comment that didn't fit. I felt like a joke, like nothing I said ever did mattered. It was starting to get creepy. The laugh was no longer just uncomfortable. It was unsettling, like he was hiding something or like he was testing me in some sick way. He kept going on and on, telling weird, disconnected stories. Some of them were about his exes, and I could tell they weren't flattering. He laughed about how they all couldn't handle his sense of humor, as if he was some kind of misunderstood genius. The whole thing was beginning to feel like a game, and I was losing. I didn't know how to leave without making it even more awkward, so I kept forcing small talk, but it wasn't working. Then he started talking about his childhood dog. I figured, okay, this might be something normal, something I can latch onto to make this date feel a little more human. But no, he told me, with this manic energy in his voice, about how the dog had run away when he was a kid. And the way he talked about it, it was almost like he was reveling in the pain. Like losing a pet was some kind of hilarious tragedy. And the worst part, I could see it in his eyes, the way he really believed it was funny. I didn't know what to do. I was stuck. I tried to keep smiling, but every time he laughed, it felt like my skin was crawling. I wanted to leave, but at the same time, I didn't want to be rude. So I did what any normal person would do. I excused myself to the bathroom. When I came back, he was still there, sitting at the table, still grinning, still laughing at nothing. It was like he was stuck in this loop. I was just a spectator. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually I made my exit. I told him I had to work early in the morning, which was true, but also a bit of an excuse. He smiled at me, that same creepy grin, and said he'd text me soon. I said something like, yeah, sure, and left. I never heard from him again. Honestly, I'm kind of glad. The whole thing felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But I'll never forget that night, how despite all the signs, I didn't listen to my gut. I'll be honest. I thought I was going to have a great time on my first date with Chris. We'd been chatting for a couple of weeks, and he seemed charming in his texts. He was all about old school chivalry, which at first seemed sweet. He would send me messages about how much he valued traditional values, and how he thought relationships should be about mutual respect. Honestly, I was kind of intrigued. He seemed like the type who would open the car door for you and maybe pull out of your chair at dinner. Not my usual type, but I thought I'd give it a shot. The night of the date, he picked me up at my apartment, and right away I knew something felt off. It wasn't that he looked bad. He was actually dressed pretty well. He had a button-up shirt and some nice jeans, and his hair was neatly combed. It was more the vibe. As soon as I opened the door, he stood there for a second too long, just smiling at me like he was about to say something profound. But then he just cleared his throat and nodded. Ready to go, he asked in this overly formal way. I shrugged and said yeah, feeling weirdly nervous. We got into his car, and as he started to drive, he started talking about how much he loved to spoil the women he dated. I remember thinking, okay, that's sweet, but also wondering what he meant by that. We pulled up to this small, cozy restaurant on the edge of town. It had a nice outdoor patio, fairy lights, the whole vibe, and I thought maybe this would be a nice change from the usual pizza and movie thing. But as soon as we stepped out of the car, things got strange. He hurried around to open my door, even though I was perfectly capable of doing it myself. I gave him a polite smile, but it felt weird. Like, I'm 25, not 85, and I can open a damn car door. He didn't seem to notice my hesitation, though. He was grinning, all proud of himself, and I just smiled back, trying not to make it awkward. When we walked inside, he made a big show of pulling out my chair. I mean, really pulling it out like he was in some old school movie. I don't know, maybe I'm too casual for this kind of thing, but I just didn't get it. I've been on plenty of dates where people are polite, but this felt like I was being treated like some delicate porcelain doll. We sat down, and the waiter handed us the menus. Now, here's where things got weird. I was about to grab the menu, but Chris beat me to it, taking it from my hands and holding it up like he was about to read it for me. I raised my eyebrows, trying to keep it cool. I don't want to seem rude, right? But then he started reading the menu out loud, as if I couldn't do it myself. "You might want to try this salmon," he said, totally ignoring the fact that I was fully capable of making my own decision. It's a classic, very elegant. I tried to reach for the menu again, hoping this was just a misunderstanding, but before I could grab it, he snapped, "Let me take care of that for you. You're the lady." The way he said it wasn't sweet, it wasn't thoughtful, it was patronizing. It was like he thought I couldn't make a choice without him, like I was some helpless creature in need of guidance. At that point, I couldn't help it. I tried to tell him, "I can get the menu, thanks," but he looked at me like I had just told him I was going to rob the place. He smiled this weird, almost smug smile and had just kept the menu in his hand. "This is what a man does," he said. His voice was so matter-of-fact, so proud of himself, that it made my skin crawl a little. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was his tone, or the way he just expected me to be okay with it. But I immediately felt small, like I wasn't seen as an equal, but as some fragile thing that needed coddling. I thought, this is not normal. I didn't want to make a scene, but I couldn't just sit there and let him treat me like a child. So I said, in the calmest way I could muster, "I appreciate the gesture, but I'm perfectly capable of choosing my own meal." I made sure to sound polite but firm, hoping he would get the hint. But he didn't. He didn't even acknowledge what I said. He just smiled and started talking about the wine selection, again acting like I needed help with that too. It was like I wasn't even there, like my opinion didn't matter. He went on and on about how a good woman would let her man take charge, as though this was some kind of ideal scenario. It felt suffocating. I was supposed to just sit back and enjoy the experience, right? But everything he did felt like a performance. He didn't even seem to care that I was uncomfortable. It was like I was supposed to appreciate his chivalry, no matter how out of place it felt. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking things, right? Maybe I was being too sensitive. So when the waiter came to take our order, I decided to go along with it. I was tired of pushing back, tired of trying to make him see that I wasn't some fragile little princess. But then it got worse. The waiter asked me what I wanted to drink, and before I could say anything, Chris took over again. "She'll have the red wine, please," he said, looking at the waiter like he had the final say in everything. My jaw nearly dropped. I opened my mouth to protest, but nothing came out. The waiter just nodded and walked away. I was so pissed at that point, but I still didn't want to make a scene. I just sat there trying to collect my thoughts. Maybe he didn't mean it this way. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I was making it out to be. But then, as he went on about some story from his childhood, I realized something. He wasn't listening to me. He wasn't seeing me. He was treating me like a role he thought I should play, and I wasn't sure how to get out of it. I finished the meal quietly, nodding along to his endless monologues, trying to find an opening to make a graceful exit. When the check came, he paid for everything without asking, and I didn't bother protesting. At this point, I just wanted to leave. On the way back to the car, I noticed he was still opening doors for me, still making these little chivalrous gestures, as if nothing was wrong. But I was done. I wasn't mad exactly, I was more exhausted. I just wanted out. When he dropped me off at my place, I smiled politely, thanked him for the night, and walked inside, closing the door behind me. I didn't hear from him again, and honestly, I didn't want to. It wasn't just the old school chivalry that bothered me. It was how it made me feel like I wasn't an equal. Like I wasn't worthy of being treated with respect, unless he decided I was. And that was a deal breaker. I'm still trying to process what happened on my first date with Linda. I mean, people have bad dates, right? But this one is a level of awful I've never even come close to before. I honestly don't know how to even begin to explain it without sounding like I'm exaggerating, but I promise you, every word of this is 100% real. It started out pretty normal. We met on a dating app a few weeks back, and after chatting back and forth, we decided to meet at this nice little bistro in town. It was the kind of place where the lights are dim, and there's a little jazz music playing in the background. Nothing too fancy, but a nice enough spot for a first date. Honestly, I wasn't expecting anything too out of the ordinary. I just wanted to get to know her and see if there was any chemistry. When I saw Linda walk in, I immediately noticed that she was different. And not in the good way either. Don't get me wrong, she wasn't unattractive. She had this cool, sort of edgy vibe to her, dark hair, piercings, and a look that said she probably didn't care what anyone thought. But something about her energy was just a little off. It wasn't obvious at first, but the more we talked, the weirder things got. She ordered a drink when we sat down, and then we got to chatting. At first, everything seemed fine. We talked about our jobs, our favorite places to hang out, the usual first date small talk. But every now and then, Linda would pause like she was deep in thought, staring at me with these huge, intense eyes. It wasn't uncomfortable at first, but after a while, it started to feel like she was analyzing me instead of just having a normal conversation. Anyway, the meal came and things started to get weird. I'd ordered the chicken parmesan and she went with some pasta dish. It was one of those moments where you're trying to act polite and not eat of a slob. But then Linda just dives into her food, almost too aggressively. She was eating fast like she was starving, which seemed a little strange, but I didn't want to judge. We were still getting to know each other, right? Then it happened. Linda suddenly froze mid-bite, her eyes widened, and she turned her head sharply to the side. I thought she was just about to cough or maybe choke on something, but then sneeze. She sneezed like all over the table. Not just a little, a cue that you can brush off. No, this was one of those sneezes where it's like your entire face explodes, and you can feel it coming from the depths of your lungs. And of course, her sneeze didn't just hit the table. No, it hit my chicken parmesan. Right there. Right in the middle of the plate. I literally watched as some mucus flew out of her nose and landed directly on my food. My mouth dropped open. For a second, I didn't know what to do. I was in shock just staring at the pile of mucus slowly spreading across my dinner. It was like time stopped for a moment. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I tried not to react too much because, I didn't want to make her feel embarrassed. I thought maybe she'd apologize or at least offer to get me a new plate. But no. Without missing a beat, Linda just wiped her nose with the back of her hand, looked down at my plate, and then, this is the part that still haunts me, she ate it. She actually ate it. I know it sounds insane, but I swear to you, she scraped the little bit of mucus that had landed on the chicken with her fork, and then she just put it right in her mouth, like it was no big deal. She chewed for a second, swallowed, and then just looked up at me like everything was fine. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know how to react. I was in a state of pure disbelief, like I had just entered some bizarre alternate reality where people sneeze on each other's food and think it's totally normal. But then Linda, clearly unaware that I was internally spiraling, just smiled and said, "It's just extra protein. My body doesn't mind it. It's good for the immune system." At that moment, I couldn't even comprehend what she was saying. Extra protein. Her body doesn't mind it. Was she seriously justifying eating her own mucus like it was some kind of health hack? I just sat there staring at her, my fork hovering in midair, unsure of whether I should just get up and leave or try to salvage the evening. She kept eating totally unbothered, and I tried to follow suit, but I honestly couldn't bring myself to touch the food. I didn't care how hungry I was. I couldn't do it. There was no way I was eating food that had just been sneezed on. That wasn't normal, and I didn't care how casual she acted about it. The worst part, she didn't even seem to realize what had happened. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. But the lack of any apology or acknowledgement was bizarre. She just kept talking, kept eating, and every so often, I'd catch her glancing over at me with that same intense look, like she was waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't bring myself to say anything. My mind was racing. Was this normal for her? Was this some weird new age health trend that I had no idea about? Why wasn't she grossed out by the fact that she had just sneezed on my food and then eaten it? I tried to keep things light, but the conversation felt forced. I kept looking at my plate, thinking about the weirdness of it all, wondering if this was some kind of test. Maybe she was seeing how far I'd let things go, how much weird I could handle before snapping. By the time the meal was over, I was ready to leave. I hadn't eaten a single bite, and I was absolutely done. I tried to be polite, but there was no way I was sticking around. I paid for my drink, said I wasn't feeling well, and just bolted. When I walked out of the restaurant, I had this weird mix of disgust and confusion swirling in my stomach. Like, what had just happened? I couldn't wrap my head around it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, no matter how much I wanted to forget it, I would never be able to unsee that moment. Linda eating her own mucus was something that would haunt me for a long time. I blocked her the next day. I didn't even need to explain why. I just couldn't do it. That date was beyond weird, and I'll never look at chicken parmesan the same way again.